Welcome to another episode of Mike's Money Picks. Today on the podcast, we're going to be breaking down the Friday, January 26th slate of college basketball DFS on DraftKings as well as FanDuel. That's right, FanDuel actually gave us a Friday night college basketball slate, which is something they haven't been doing a lot of recently. And we've actually got two power conference games on this Friday night. Normally I've kind of half jokingly said that, Fridays are mid-major Fridays. But this season hasn't really given us a whole lot of those so far. On this Friday night, FanDuel has just opted for the two high major conference games, whereas DraftKings is giving us the two high major conference games as well as a matchup in the A10 as well. So we got one mid-major game here on this Friday night slate, but it's three pretty solid looking games, especially the later game I think is really juicy. So we're going to break down all three games here on this show. We're going to tell you who you need to be targeting for your DFS lineups, as well as FanDuel and DraftKings, or on FanDuel and DraftKings, as well as just kind of how you can attack each game and the different angles for which you can construct that lineup, and just kind of ways you can win in DFS on DraftKings and FanDuel for this Friday night slate. Now, while you're here, make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel as well as to the audio feed, because we are going to be back for the Saturday slate, and hopefully, if everything goes according to plan, for the Sunday slate as well. I had to take a one-day break this week because of my 4-month-old daughter not really sleeping a whole lot at night, but last night was a good night. I'm sitting here recording this at about 10:15 Eastern time, so hoping tonight is going to be a good night, and if everything continues to go according to plan, we'll be back for Saturday and Sunday. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel so that we can get notified when those episodes drop. And also, if you want to help me out, please hit the like button on YouTube, as well as rate and review the podcast on audio form. It really helps me out a ton. I cannot stress that enough, and I really do appreciate you guys for doing that. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this three-game slate. All right, so the first game of the night is a showdown in the Big Ten between Michigan State and Wisconsin. It is the lowest game total on the slate. However, what is interesting about this one is this is actually a rematch. Both of these teams have already played, so I don't want to, totally pigeonhole it and just think that everything is going to be exactly like the first meeting, because it won't be exactly like the first meeting. But I do think you can look at what both teams did in that meeting and, look at the box score and just kind of see what the general strategy was, what the flow of the game was, and kind of just how everything shook out from what's the word I'm looking for? Kind of a step back perspective, like a whole view, a bird's eye view. There we go. That's what I was looking for. As opposed to, trying to nitpick like individual stats. So this game, KenPom has it projected to be Wisconsin 72-68 for a 140-point total, which, like I said, is the bottom on the slate by 2 points. Both of these teams rank in the bottom 100 in tempo in the nation, according to KenPom. However, what you look at when you look at the box score of both of these teams, what you see is two teams that are willing to play at the pace of their opponent. Right? Like when both of these teams have played the likes of the faster teams in the Big Ten, like Northwestern, like Illinois, they can get into shootouts. When they play the slower teams in the Big Ten, like Maryland, like Rutgers, they tend to play lower scoring games. So they're both willing, content to play at the pace of their opponent. Well, neither one of them is looking to push the tempo either. So I don't know if the tempo will ever get out of second gear in this game, with neither team really looking to push it. So, in that first meeting, there was only 127 points scored. Wisconsin won that game 70-57. Now, we're going to talk about that game as well as kind of the whole season look. So, Tyson Walker from Michigan State has been their best player, and he was their best player in that game. Over the course of the season, he has a 28% usage rate and a 33% shot rate. Pretty much one thing is certain with Michigan State every single slate, which is Tyson Walker is going to get double-digit shots. And look, we've seen them on the slate time and time again now. Like, we know what we're going to get with Tyson Walker. He's going to get a lot of shots. He has a legitimate 50 fantasy point ceiling, but it's more likely than not that he's going to get you between 30 and 35 fantasy points, which for his salary is about 4x value, and we'll take it. In the previous game against Wisconsin, he only had 20 shots. I say that facetiously because 20 shots is quite a lot. But he did score 34 fantasy points in that game. In fact, he has led the team in shooting in 6 of 8 conference games. He has taken the most shots on the team in 6 of 8 conference games is what I mean by that. So, you're getting a guy who's going to get a ton of shots, and he did lead the team in shots in that game against Wisconsin. He and AJ Hogard were the only two guys on the team to get more than 7 shots in that game. So what you can see is the Michigan State really tried to use their their two guards to kind of attack Wisconsin on the perimeter and get there that way. And Hogard had a successful outing as well. He had 31.5 fantasy points in this game. These were the only two guys to really hit value for Michigan State in that game. It's kind of hard to hit value when you only score 57 points, and as a team, you have a pretty low assist rate. In fact, there are other supporting players, Sissoko, Hall, and Akins. Their other three starters, for that matter, they combined for 20 fantasy points in that game against Wisconsin, which is ugly. Now, since that game, we've seen Malik Hall's role expand, and we've seen him have some ceiling games. Could he have a ceiling game against Wisconsin? I don't think it's necessarily pretty likely. I think that Wisconsin is a pretty good defensive team, especially at the forward position. He's going to be going up against Tyler Wall, who's a pretty good defender. And we've also seen Malik Hall tends to do better in better game environments. And this is not projecting to be a great game environment. So probably a pass for me. But like I've said about Malik Hall time and time again, if you're playing a GPP, if you're doing 20 max lineups, you got to put him in one of them, in my opinion, because he does have a potential for a ceiling game, and you're going to want him in your roster if he has that ceiling game. Now, after him, one thing we do have to talk about is Jaden Akins' injury. So he has an ankle injury, and I can't find anything definitive on him playing or not playing in this game. The good news is this is the first game of the slate, so we'll be able to have that information before lock. If he does not play, it would give a lot of boosted minutes to Trey Holloman, who is only 4,500, and he will be a really solid play if Jaden Akins does in fact sit. In that first game against Wisconsin, he came off the bench, played 20 minutes, but only put up 9.5 fantasy points, but he did take 7 shots in that game. So I don't think that Holloman is a bad option at all if Akins sits. I think he's probably one of the best value plays on the slate if Akins sits, just because there's so little value to go by. Now, another detail that we need to focus on with Michigan State is their center position. So currently, Carson Cooper is playing more minutes than Manny Sissoko. At least in the last 2 games combined, Cooper has played more minutes, played 27 minutes against Maryland, but he doesn't get a whole lot of usage when he's out there. He only took 1 shot in those 27 minutes and put up 11 fantasy points. The center position is just not a very lucrative role for Michigan State right now, especially in a slower tempo game. Now, one guy I wouldn't mind taking a dart throw on, though, is Jackson Kohler. He only played 2 minutes in that Maryland game, but if you've ever watched him play, he is a low post scorer. He's a guy that when he's out there, they will get the ball to on the block, and he can get some buckets. So on a slate that's so bereft of value, I don't mind taking a punt play on a guy like Jackson Kohler at 3,000, because if he does get to double-digit minutes, he has a chance at getting legitimate 5x value. Now, on the Wisconsin side of things, they were much more successful in that first game against Michigan State. In that game, center Steven Crowell had 34.5 fantasy points. Look, we know what we're getting out of Crowell this season. He has about 40 fantasy point ceiling. He has a very good chance to give you 30, but he also kind of has these games where he doesn't really do a whole lot. And those games where he doesn't do a whole lot tend to be the slower paced contests, which worries me about this one, because this one can be a slower paced contest. But again, in that first game, he put up 34.5 fantasy points. So I don't think he's a terrible option, but I don't think he is a great option either. He's not a slam dunk play, but he's certainly going to make my player pool. Also in that game, Tyler Wall had 22 fantasy points. We've seen Tyler Wall over the course of the season play well at his power forward spot when the other teams play small ball at the power forward spot, and that's not the case with Michigan State having Malik Hall. AJ Storr in that game also was probably one of their better players. But AJ Storr, it's the same complaint we've talked about all season long. You've heard me say this before. He doesn't do a whole lot else outside of scoring. In that Michigan State game, he was great. 22 real points, 8 for 11 from the field, 5 boards, 30.75 fantasy points. That's good, but at a salary of $6,800, that's barely above 4x. And, his ceiling this season has only been 36 fantasy points because he just only does so much else outside of scoring. His ceiling games, one of them came in the Minnesota game this past game where he finally got a double-double and got 12 boards. So to me, the only problem with Storr, I think it's very likely that Storr gets between 28 and 34 fantasy points in this game. But the problem with Storr is that he just doesn't have a ceiling for much more unless he's going to give you a big peripheral stat game, which tends to come in these more fast-paced contests, and this is not one of them. So kind of like the same thing I said about Crowell, he's going to make my player pool. I probably won't play the two of them together because I think that it's going to be really tough for both of them to get a ceiling game, but both of them will make my player pool, but they're not going to be core plays or anything like that. Chucky Hepburn is also interesting. He's the team's point guard. He had 25.3 fantasy points in that first game against Michigan State, really filled up the stat sheet. And he's been kind of pedestrian lately. He hasn't been taking as many shots because a lot of them have been going to AJ Store. And, he's not doing a whole lot else in the peripheral stats. He's getting a decent amount of rebounds and assists, but not like you would like for a guy whose salary is $6,200. So he's probably a pass for me. Maybe a guy that if I'm 20 maxing fits into one lineup. Now, Kamari McGee is a backup guard for Wisconsin who's really a role player. Like he plays about like if you look at the course of the season, about 10 minutes a game. But that, he's going to be out for the foreseeable future. And that opens up 10 minutes a game for somebody else, right? So I think you could see John Blackwell end up with a little bit more minutes off the bench. I think you could also see Connor Essegian end up with more minutes off the bench. So Connor Essegian is another guy like Jackson Kohler. They're really very similar DFS plays for this slate because they're both guys that last year had a bigger role on the team than they do now. They're guys that when they're out there have high usage rates and get legitimate shot attempts. And they're guys that are $3,000. So like on a slate that's so little value plays available, if I'm going to punt a play off like this, I'm going to punt on a guy who, has a legitimate chance at maybe if he plays double digit minutes, he's going to give me some serious fantasy points. Like if I'm going to punt a play on this slate, it would be one of those two guys. And especially on the FanDuel slate, there's very little value to go by. And you're going to have to take some chances on guys like that if you want to pay up for some of the higher priced options from the Stanford and Cal game. More on that a little bit later. And I think those will be the two guys that I would be willing to do that with, because we have seen in the past a high usage rate and a chance to play double digit minutes. All right, so that does it for game number one. Game number two is the battle in the A10 between St. Joe's and St. Bonaventure, Battle of the Saints. So this game is currently projected on KenPom to be 73-69 in favor of the Bonnies. Now, if I'm being honest, St. Joe's has been one of the most disappointing teams in all conference play in the entire country. They were really good in the non-conference. They almost beat Kentucky. They had a few other really solid wins to their resume, but they've really thrown their season down the drain, thrown their at-large bid chances down the drain here at the start of A10 season, and they're going to be looking to bounce back so that way maybe they could sneak in by winning the conference tournament. But they're not playing as well now as they were at the start of the season is the bottom line. And so if this line were, like a month ago, I don't think St. Bonaventure would have been 4-point favorites. The good news is with St. Joe's is that they significantly condensed their rotation. If there's no foul trouble, exactly 6 and only 6 guys are going to play 25 plus minutes. That is Lynn Greer III, LG3, Eric Reynolds, Cameron Brown, Rashir Fleming, and Christ Esengutoko. That's their starting 5. And then Xavier Brown is the guy who will come off the bench and spell the 3 guards. And then Casper Klaspek and Sean Simmons, or Casper Klaksik, I guess is how you should say it, and Sean Simmons. Those are the 2 guys that'll spell the bigs. But again, Klaksik and Simmons aren't going to play a whole lot of minutes because they're kind of like, splitting that last little bit of rotation. So really it's just the top 6 that are seeing a whole lot of minutes. And the problem is all 6 of them are expensive. None of them stand out as value plays. The usage for this team has been all over the place also. In conference play, they have centered more of their usage around their 2 starting guards, Eric Reynolds and Lynn Greer III. Eric Reynolds is the guy I would prefer among the 2 of them. To me, he has the higher ceiling. Like you look at his game log and you see multiple 40 fantasy point games, 2 in his last 4 to be exact. And you also see these games where he takes heavy amount of shots. Like he has a 21 shot game, a 17 shot game, multiple 15 shot games. Lynn Greer III, when he tends to have bigger games, it's not that high of a shot number and it's not that high of a ceiling. He tends to put up more in rebounding and assists as well. So I think if I'm playing these 2 guys, I might consider Greer for more of a cash game play and Reynolds for more of a GPP tournament play. But both of them will make my player pool. But I'm, again, kind of like some of the guys in the Michigan State-Wisconsin game. I'm not sold on them enough to say like they're going to be core plays. I'm going to have them in every lineup, but they're definitely going to make my player pool. Rashir Fleming is a guy that I was really high on heading into conference play because he was just elite in the non-conference. He had 3 straight games of over 33 fantasy points at one point in the non-conference. And the problem is in conference play, he hasn't been that same guy. He's dealt with a lot of foul trouble, and his salary is up from where it was. It's now $7,000 on DraftKings. So you're going to need him like there's a pathway to a ceiling game for Rasheer Fleming, but it's a narrow pathway because he's going to have to stay out of foul trouble. He's going to have to probably get you a double double, and he's going to have to be the guy that they really go through, which they haven't really done a whole lot of lately. So he's a guy that, again, kind of like I've said a lot this episode, he's going to make my player pool, but I'm not going to be playing a whole lot of it just because I know the ceiling is there. And I think if Fleming were to have a big game, I probably wouldn't pair him with Reynolds, but with Greer having a really high assist rate, I would probably pair Greer with Rasheer Fleming. Christ Esendoko is the starting center, and he's kind of had more of a role in conference play, whereas Fleming is having less of a role. Chris Desendoko does have a 40 fantasy point game in the game against Duquesne that they played about a week ago. And so, again, he's going to make my player pool. He's got a legitimate ceiling, but I'm not really sold on him as a permanent play. Now, Xavier Brown may be the Brown that comes off the bench for St. Joe's, but he's the one that has a higher usage rate. He tends to get about 9 shots a game, has a ceiling of about 33 fantasy points. I think he's a pretty solid play at $6,400. He might be one of my more favorite plays because, especially if Greer or Reynolds gets in foul trouble, he can play a lot of minutes. Now, on the St. Bonaventure side, the interesting thing to monitor here is Micah Adams-Woods, their point guard, is questionable for this game. He didn't play against Duquesne due to an illness. I don't know if he's going to play this one or not, but what happened in that game was they moved Kyrell Luke into the starting lineup, and on paper, it looks like an absolute dud of a game because he only had 8 fantasy points and he fouled out, and he also had 4 turnovers. But if you look deeper, he had a high usage rate. It was a 26% usage rate. He was just 0 for 9 from the field. Like, I kind of think that if he's going to get another start, he's going to be in line for some regression shooting. And I'm willing to go back to him at a salary of only $4,400, even though that game was a dud. I'm hoping that just people who game log watch or box score watch just don't realize that he actually had a high usage and a high shot rate and stay away from him. Daryl Banks is the other guy that you would have thought got boosted minutes in the absence of Micah Adams-Woods. He got a lot of minutes. It was 29 minutes, but he was also 0 for 9 from the field and only put up 8 fantasy points. Again, I'm kind of willing to buy on a little bit of shooting regression here and hope that, if Adams-Woods is out again, either Banks or Luke is going to be able to return value. Now, what's also interesting is Moses Flowers 3 games ago was inserted into the starting lineup for Daryl Banks. Daryl Banks comes off the bench now. And in those 3 games, Flowers has taken 7, 10, and 9 shots, and he scored between 10 and 17 fantasy points. I think that the fact that he's starting is a little bit interesting, but there's not a real genuine ceiling here. But at only $4,700, he doesn't have to do a whole lot. So he's another guy that I would probably, if I'm attacking this St. Bonaventure guard situation, I'm somebody who plays multiple lineups. I'll probably play a little bit of Banks, a little bit of Flowers, a little bit of Luke, but none of them in the same lineup together. Now, the guy that I would be willing to play with some other St. Bonaventure guys is Chad Venig. He leads the team in usage at 30%. The only thing that caps him, though, is there are games where he doesn't play a whole lot of minutes, generally when he gets into foul trouble, but he can get a lot of points in the low post. He can get a lot of block shots as well. He's a guy that I really like, and he's only $6,300. Charles Pride is their leader in price tag at $7,700, but I am not a fan from a DFS perspective. Now, if you just look at the game log, you see some really good performances, but they always happen when he's super efficient from the field. He's not a high usage player. It's under 20% for the season, but he's a good player. Like, he makes a lot of his shots. And so he's got a razor thin line in fantasy where if he doesn't hit 50% of his shots, it's going to be a dud of a night just because there's not enough shot attempts or peripheral stats to get there in other ways. So Charles Pride, very narrow pathway, in my opinion, not one of my favorite plays. So that does it for St. Bonaventure. Now let's take a look at the prize game of the night, Stanford at Cal. This one is projected to be 78-77 according to KenPom for a total of 155, which is the highest on the night by a total of 11 points. And look, I think this is the game that you're going to want to stack up. For Stanford, they've completely revolutionized their team in the last 5 or so games. They moved Kanan Carlisle into the starting lineup, and he has been their guy, dominating the usage rate for him. And then Maxime Reynaud has been a huge beneficiary to Carlisle being in the lineup. He had a stretch of 3 straight 40-point games before their win against Washington on Sunday. And I'm kind of willing to go back to that formula of Carlisle and Reynaud, right? Now, the only problem with this Stanford team is there's not a whole lot of value plays that I'm interested in. Stojakovic and Gieler will play minutes off the bench, but it's a very narrow pathway. You're going to need him to have a hot shooting night if you want him to come through. Spencer Jones had a ceiling game against Washington, 46 fantasy points, 30 real points, went 8 for 12 from the three. But to me, that's an outlier game, and I'm not going to chase the outlier game at a price tag that's a little bit inflated on a slate that doesn't have a whole lot of value. Now, on the Cal side, the good news is they've condensed their rotation a ton, super condensed. Their last game was an overtime game, so there's a little bit of a caveat there. But 5 guys played 36 minutes or more of that game. That's 80% of the minutes in an overtime game. I know that because I teach high school math. So in that game, Jalen Cone, Jalen Celestine, Keontae Kennedy, Jaywin Tyson, and Ferdals Amack all played 36 minutes or more. They pretty much don't take any of those guys off the floor. Grant Newell, as well as Rodney Brown Jr., those two played minutes off the bench, but if they want to have a ceiling game, they're going to need somebody to get in foul trouble. Kind of like what I was saying with Esigian and Kohler. They're value plays that I would go to because if their guys do get in foul trouble, if the starters get in foul trouble, they're going to play 20 plus minutes in a game environment that's really, really good. It's kind of like a value play that has a different pathway than a Sejan and Kohler. Sejan and Kohler's pathway would be a lot of minutes and a lot of usage. These two guys' pathway would be a lot of minutes in a game that's going to feature a lot of possessions because possessions lead to fantasy points when there's more points, rebounds, and assists, being totaled on the stat sheet. So I would have those two in my player pool very minimally, and I would be very careful who I stack them with if I'm putting them in my player pool because if they're playing, somebody else is in foul trouble. Now, I really like Jaywin Celestine on here, especially on the FanDuel slate. I think he's one of the best values on the entire slate. He's going to play a ton of minutes. He's going to get a moderate amount of shots, but he's also going to get you some rebounds and assists as well. I just think he's a great value play. Keontae Kennedy is not bad. I would rather pay down to Celestine. Keontae Kennedy generally gets more shots, but to me, on a points per dollar basis, I'd rather play Celestine. Jalen Cone is a shooter that if this game really shoots out, he might have a hot shooting night and might get there. But the guys that everything centers around for Cal are Jaywin Tyson and Ferdals Amack. They dominate the usage rate for this team. But it's not uncommon for them to have a game where both of them are over 28%. In fact, in their most recent game against Washington State, they combined for 99 fantasy points. So I think you can play the two of them together. I think you can play one of them. If you play two of them together, you're going to have to save some salary elsewhere, especially if you want to play guys on the Stanford side. But I think that this Stanford and Cal game really is the game that I'm going to want to attack. I think you can play it from any angle. I think you can get your value plays from this game. I think you can play the studs in this game, or I think you can just total onslaught this game. I think this is the best game environment slate and probably on average the one that I'm going to be playing the most players from. All right, so that does it for the Friday, January 26th slate of college basketball DFS. If you want more from me, you heard me talk here on this episode. You want to know who makes my actual lineups? There's a few ways you can get that information out of me. First, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike's Money Picks. I'm more than happy to answer questions on there, as well as I tweet out any updates for the show on there as well. I'm also in the Fantasy Corner Discord. Link is in the description on YouTube, as well as the audio feed. Fantasy Corner Discord, we've got a lot of smart people in there who've won a lot of money recently playing college basketball DFS, and we're just in there all day talking projections, talking strategy, talking plays, and then at night we're sweating it out together. It's a blast. We also do other sports like NBA, golf, NFL. It's just a great community to be in if you want more people to talk about DFS with. And then if you want to know who my core plays are, as well as my lineup strategy and attacking strategy for the slate, head on over to the Patreon, patreon.com/Mike's Money Picks. I think that there's a lot of good information in there that can help you be a better college basketball DFS player. And also the Patreon helps me fund a lot of the stuff that you hear me, talking about with the data here on the show. So if you want to support the show, follow me on Twitter, subscribe to the channel, like the video, or subscribe to the Patreon. Those are all ways you can show support to the show. All right, so that does it for this episode, y'all. So hopefully I was able to give you guys some good information on helping you build your lineups for this Friday night slate. Hopefully my daughter's going to let me sleep tonight, and I'll be able to be back for the Saturday and the Sunday slates as well. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel so you know when those episodes drop. Thank you guys for watching and listening to this point. Good luck to you on this Friday night slate, and I will see you guys next time.